How much do you actually have to contribute to a record before you're allowed to say that you've worked with the artist? Because some people in this industry have a somewhat malleable definition of worked with. For example, there's an engineer who everyone watching this video can probably figure out who I'm talking about, but I'm not going to name him. I don't want to cause any hate or anything like that. Let's just call him He Who Shall Not Be Named, or perhaps Audio Voldemort. So he writes the following, and this is a verbatim quote. With 25 plus years in the game, I have mastered for legends like A Tribe Called Quest, Depeche Mode, Britney Spears, and The White Stripes. Great! I'm a massive fan of Jack White, so let's look up the 6 White Stripes albums and see which particular album this engineer has worked on with Jack and Meg. So let's go in chronological order. So their first album, The White Stripes, nope. Their second album, The Style, nope. Their third album, White Blood Cells, nope. Fourth album, Elephant, nope. Get Behind Me Satan, nope. Icky Thump, nope. So then I pulled up all of the other albums from the White Stripes, the live recordings and the stuff that is kind of scraping the barrel where you wouldn't really have worked with Jack and Meg on something, but you could probably at that point say, okay, I mastered a live album or something. But I couldn't find a single credit from this engineer, even for some kind of random live album. In fact, the only credit that I could find was a lacquer cut for a regional release of a single that had already been mastered by another mastering engineer. So when you name drop the White Stripes as a key artist that you have personally worked with, but you didn't work with them, and all you did was cut one single random lacquer for a regional single the artist probably didn't even know about, well then at that point, I don't know if that's even a stretch anymore. Is that a stretch or is that just a lie? So the next key artist, which he name drops right at the top of his bio that he has worked with, is Britney Spears. So again, the only credit that I could find in his entire discography was some random weird compilation CD, and the Britney Spears track, which is on there, was, as far as I'm aware, mastered by another mastering engineer. Maybe he mastered the DDP, or like he did the Red Book mastering, like he actually burnt the CD and put the metadata in and stuff like that. But he didn't actually do anything to the sound. He just kind of like touched it and sent it to the factory. I don't really know, but judging by Discogs credits, it doesn't seem like that is an honest real credit that he's actually worked with Britney Spears either. So let's continue down the list of key credits of this person working with Depeche Mode. Again, I just can't find a single mastering credit for this mastering engineer to have worked with Depeche Mode. So next up is A Tribe Called Quest. And again, I'm unable to find one single credit attributed to this mastering engineer in relation to A Tribe Called Quest. The closest thing that I can find is that he mastered someone else's music which had a sample from A Tribe Called Quest in it. And he mastered that. So if that is the credit that is worked with A Tribe Called Quest because the remix or whatever artist sampled A Tribe Called Quest and then he mastered that, that is such a stretch that at that point I'm prepared to say that that's just lying that is worked with A Tribe Called Quest. But again, I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt here. Maybe I just can't find the credit. Maybe he has worked with, but there's just no credit there. So they were the first key artists which this mastering engineer name drops right at the start of his bio. But I'm unable to find any credits associating him with these artists on any significant release whatsoever. But if you continue reading his blurb, you can see that he claims to have also worked with Usher. Now, I looked up the credits on this as well, and I found that he cut a remix release of the single Burn. So Burn itself was actually mastered by Herb Powers, a legendary mastering engineer. He just mastered some random remix that wasn't made by Usher, it was made by the remix artist. So again, unless I'm mistaken, Audio Voldemort claims to have worked with Usher directly, but he didn't in fact work with Usher as far as my research suggests. And Usher probably never met the guy and probably doesn't even know who he was. So I could be wrong about all of this. Maybe I just can't find the right credits, but you'd think if this engineer had actually properly worked with any of these massive artists on anything that was even slightly significant in their discographies, you would imagine it would be possible to find some kind of credit. Now, if you squint really hard and stretch this really thin, then maybe these credits could be technically legal in the eyes of the law, but I just personally think intuitively it's all just bullshit. But the reason why this comes together is because of the way that regional releases work, and many people don't actually understand this. So when people say, oh, I've worked with Britney Spears and Usher and the White Stripes and Kasabian and all of these people, and then they just kind of believe them because they don't expect them to just bullshit or just make that up. They actually take them on their word. But if you understand how regional releases work, you'll know how ridiculously stretched that is and how it's essentially borderline just lying, if not actually lying. So here's how an album normally gets made, especially back in the 90s and 2000s. So a famous artist is going to record the album, probably in America. It gets mixed by some world famous mixing engineer, probably in America. And then it gets mastered by some ultra famous mastering engineer like Bob Ludwig or Bernie Grundman or someone like that. Again, probably in America, New York, LA, Nashville, one of these big three places in America. And only after that's done, only after the masters are fully approved by the artist and the record label and everyone's happy, then the record label will then send it out to its regional partners. So the UK office gets it, the German office gets it, Australia, Japan, and all of those regional offices then handle the local manufacturing because they're not shipping tens of thousands of records across the ocean. So all of the physical product, the CDs, the cassettes, the vinyls, they get all manufactured locally and distributed regionally. And because vinyl is the biggest, the heaviest, the most expensive and involved to manufacture, let's discuss that first. So how do you manufacture a vinyl record? Well, firstly, you need to cut a lacquer, and the Neumann, typically, or Scully cutting lathe is going to be housed in a mastering studio. Now, you could cut a lacquer and send it across the ocean, but you don't typically do that because they're a bit fragile. So you've got the cutting engineer who's going to be some guy locally. Then that is going to be sent to a press-in facility to do the galvanic stuff, where you need all of the galvanic baths and all of the machinery to make a stamper and all of that kind of stuff. And then you need to stamp that actually into vinyl records with vinyl presses. And they're really big and expensive and loud and noisy, so that can't really happen in the same place that you're cutting the record typically. That's going to be in a factory. So you've got two different places that need to be locally sourced in order to produce a vinyl record. So after all of the superstars in America are finished doing their bit and it gets sent to the regional partners, let's say in the UK, well then the regional label is just going to send it out to some random place to get cut locally in the UK, and then they're going to send that to the vinyl factory or something to get pressed. And so it's not really a case that Jack White or Britney Spears is personally selecting this local cutting engineer who's going to make the lacquer for the regional pressing in the UK or Germany or Japan. Britney Spears probably doesn't know about any of these guys. The local guy is just sending it out to whoever he sometimes works with, maybe him, it doesn't really matter, just get it cut and send it to the factory. And so that's generally the process. So the engineer who actually cut the record didn't really shape the sound or anything. The mastering was already done in America. He didn't make any creative decisions. He didn't work with Britney Spears. He never met Britney Spears. All he's doing is cutting flat, which means he's not touching anything at all. He's just operating the lathe, he's getting the lacquer cut, and he's putting it in a box, and he's sending it up the road to West London to get it pressed and made into a stamper, and they're going to press it and manufacture it. And something that a lot of people don't know is, at top mastering studios, the senior engineers don't typically sit there all day cutting lacquers. What generally happens is they give that task to the lower tier engineers who sit in a side room cutting the lacquers, while the senior engineers get on with their day making actual money in the main rooms, working on the creative decisions and actually working on the records themselves. So there's no reason for any of the senior engineers to sit with the lathe, babysitting it, waiting to hit the time button. That's just given to like the junior engineers. So very often, lacquer cutting credits for regional pressings usually means that the cutting engineer had almost zero involvement in making the record. He just operated the lathe for 3 minutes, and now he's magically worked with Britney Spears. All right, mate. It's like a guy down the pub who claims to be going out with this super hot girl, but then when you actually ask her, she doesn't even know who he is. Now, when I was an intern 20 years ago, one of my jobs was making Red Book masters for obscure catalogue releases, and I'd take the audio that had already been mastered by someone else, mainly stuff that was done before I was born, and I'd just rip it into Wavelab and then make a PQ sheet and send it off to be manufactured for the new regional release. And most of the time, I had zero impact on the actual sound. But if I wanted to play the same game that Audio Voldemort is up to, and if I had zero ethics, well, here's my version. Technically, at some point early on in my career, if my memory serves me correctly, when I was an intern, I came into some form of professional contact with insignificant releases from Barry White, the Mahavishnu Orchestra, Jethro Tull, Yes, The Doors, and Queen. Did I actually work with those artists? Obviously not. But the hilarious thing is, if I was to play this game of fake credits, my fake credits are actually more impressive than Audio Voldemort's. And also, when I was an intern at another London studio, again about 20 years ago, one of the tasks that I was given was to electronically catalogue a bunch of the DAT masters that were just laying about from records that had been mixed at that particular studio. And it just so happened that one of the DAT tapes, which I catalogued, was also a single from Kasabian's first album. It might have even been the same single that this particular engineer, this Audio Voldemort engineer, claims to have mastered when he actually just cut it. So as it turns out, I've worked with Kasabian as well. So both me and Audio Voldemort worked on the exact same album. What a coincidence! But if we're going to stop lying about our involvement and actually ask where the line is, how much do you actually have to have done to a record before claiming the credit? Honestly, what happens if you genuinely mastered a significant album from an artist, but the changes you made were tiny because it already sounded good? What happens if you spent a full week stem mastering an album from an artist doing real substantial work, but the label insisted on putting their guy in the final hurdle, and then so the mastering credit actually went to another guy and not you, despite the fact the real important sound was made by you? Well, I've been in both of those situations. I've hardly done anything and got a credit, and I've done a boatload of work and then someone else claimed my credit. Now, here's the rule that I personally use, which I think makes sense. You can honestly say that you've worked with an artist on a record if the artists themselves personally approved the specific work which you did. So it's really simple. If you were just in the room when someone else was doing the work, then that obviously doesn't count. If you cut some regional lacquer or made some edit that the original artist was never even aware of, they didn't even know it existed, let alone approved some actual tonal thing which you did, then you didn't work with them. You're just piggybacking on their clout to make yourself look better when they have no idea probably who you are. So personally, I choose not to name drop artists that I might have some distant connection with just because they're famous, because I want to pretend to be successful. I am successful because the artists who come and work with me do so because of word of mouth or because I'm respected in their particular niche. So you might ask, well, who have you worked with then? If you say that all of these credits are kind of stretching it, what are the names that you can assign to your credits? Well, I've been very transparent about the fact that I mainly master techno and other forms of electronic underground music. I've never said that I work with Grammy award-winning pop artists in America, because I don't. I work with underground electronic music. And some of the stuff that I've done has got millions of streams, but I'm not interested in name dropping the stuff that just has higher play counts, because often that stuff is whack. The decent stuff, which I'm actually proud to associate myself with, is mainly underground stuff, and not the kind of pop drivel that wins Grammys. So for anyone who is interested in any of the stuff that I've done, where I actually have contributed meaningfully to the sound of the record, and from artists where I could actually call them up on the phone and they would actually know who I am, well, I'll name a few now. So anything that Xanias has done. Her most recent record, Cataclysm, it came out about a year ago, and that was an absolute banger, and I've worked on most of her stuff. Anything by the Meek Dagger, absolutely phenomenal EPs, and the guy is an absolute legend in a very specific niche. Veer by Tommy 47 was an absolute landmark techno album. And I've also collaborated with the same guy, and we made an album called Vicarious Memories under the name These Hidden Hands. And that's something that I'm especially proud of. It was an absolute honor when Silent Servant and Function asked me to remaster the classic Samwell District album, Feed Forward. And again, if you ask Bob down the road what Feed Forward is, they're not going to know, they're not going to have a clue. But if you ask anyone who has any idea about that scene, it's one of the most significant albums ever released in its niche. Scanning Backwards by Phase Patel was an absolute banger album, and The Edge of Everything is currently the only full-length solo album by Paula Temple, and when that came out, there was an absolute defining release in modern hard techno. And again, if you ask someone down your local pub who Paula Temple is, they probably will have no idea. But she's without a doubt one of the most significant techno artists of the modern era. Another artist in modern techno who's not just significant, but actually one of my personal favorite artists in the genre is Ancient Methods. And these artists that I'm mentioning here are absolutely unknown in the mainstream. I've never worked with anyone who everyone knows like Britney Spears because I don't do American pop music. But anyone who has the first clue about the kind of music that I work with obviously knows these artists. A great litmus test is someone like Ron Morelli. So almost nobody watching this video is going to know who he is or understand his music, but he's hugely respected in his particular niche, and his record label is widely considered to be legendary. Lucrecia Dalt, Syzygy. It's a masterpiece. How many plays does it have on Spotify? It doesn't have plays on Spotify because for some reason the release was pulled from the streaming services, and I have no idea why. These are the kinds of credits that I'm proud of. Actual high quality music which is extremely respected in its given niche, not random fake White Stripes credits. This is stuff that I've actually worked on and contributed meaningfully to the sound of, and where I've actually got a working relationship with the artists. Scraping the barrel with fake Britney Spears shit because you cut a regional 7-inch single for a remix of some artist who has never heard of you before. Not only is that embarrassing, it's a disgrace to our industry, and it deserves to be called out. So what do you think about fake credits? Should I start saying that I've mastered records by Barry White and the Mahavishnu Orchestra? Or do you think that meaningful contributions should actually have been made and they should actually be approved by the original artist if you're going to claim that you've worked with them?